Welcome to the Museum of Boring Things. Here, ordinary objects rest beneath the hush of time. We gather not for spectacle, but for stillness, to trace the quiet ingenuity pressed into everyday form. Tonight's exhibit is the CD, fashioned in obscurity, indispensable in practice, carrying the soft weight of anonymous invention. Let your thoughts uncoil and your breath settle in. Should drowsiness arrive before our story concludes, consider it a courtesy of the collection. Now, let us open the glass case and listen for the silence between its hinges. There is something almost ceremonial in the sheen of a compact disc. That soft shimmer of concentric rainbows bending light as if whispering secrets to a moth's wing. One does not expect such delicacy from something born in a laboratory. Yet here we are, staring into a small circular mirror that once held the music of nations, the memories of birthdays, the digital whispers of an era pretending to be permanent. Before the CD came into being, before its polymer soul was stamped and spun, there was polycarbonate. A transparent plastic, unassuming and soft-spoken, the kind one might imagine forming the shell of a careful tortoise in a bureaucratic dream. Polycarbonate, derived from the union of bisphenol A and phosgene, was selected for its clarity, durability, and willingness to be shaped. It had no idea, of course, that it would soon serve as the bedrock of late 20th century audio ephemera. This plastic, when cooled and molded, bore an uncanny resemblance to frozen intention. Scientists sought a medium that could hold not a groove like vinyl, but a silence punctuated by microscopic pits, a topography of encoded absence. It had to reflect light precisely and absorb none of it. A disc of obedience, polished until even fingerprints hesitated to cling. The faint hush of felt gloves follows this thought. The idea of storing sound as light did not arrive overnight. For decades, engineers had flirted with lasers, like librarians nervously courting a candle in a paper library. The laser's narrow beam, cool and precise, could read the most delicate of patterns, if those patterns were etched just so. And so it was that Philips and Sony, in a collaboration as cautious as it was consequential, began to co-develop a digital audio disc that could be read optically. In the hush of Eindhoven laboratories and the patient corridors of Tokyo research centers, they imagined the future, a sound carrier immune to wear, unblemished by needle scratches and encoded in ones and zeros rather than grooves and hiss. A disc whose data could be read by bouncing light into pits smaller than a red blood cell, each one shaped like a pause in a windless room. The whispered glide of a curator's sleeve brushes past the display. To understand how this came to be, one must consider the laser itself not the flamboyant, villainous beam of science fiction, but the steady, red diode kind, faintly humming with a librarian's temperament. These low-powered lasers were first used in the 1970s for barcode scanners, an application so dull it feels like a sneeze caught mid-thought. Yet it proved something vital. A laser could read precise patterns off plastic without complaint. The CD's earliest ancestors were video discs larger, wobblier formats that promised cinematic magic, but delivered only mild inconvenience and faint nausea when watched during dinner. The digital audio disc refined the principle, reduced size, increased fidelity, and convinced the public that perfection could be flat, circular, and silver. The notion was as radical as a whisper in a stadium. Slowly, the world leaned closer to listen. And so they began stamping the disc's tiny pits molded into a spiral track, beginning at the center and coiling outward like a snail performing calligraphy. Each pit represented a bit, and each flat surface, called a land, stood for its digital counterpart. The laser would reflect differently depending on the topology, and a photodiode would translate this optical Morse code into electrical signals. These signals were then converted into analog waves, music, words, software, the tender static of a dial-up heart. A faint shimmer of refracted light flickers across the glass casing. The standard was precise, 120 millimeters in diameter, 1.2 millimeters thick, 74 minutes of audio. Why 74 minutes? Legend whispers of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, whose full glory needed that much time. In truth, the number had more to do with early limitations in data density, but history prefers a poetic lie to a sober equation. The CD's surface was coated with aluminum, chosen not for romance but for its reflectivity, resistance, and availability, rather like an accountant chosen for his ability to remain unnoticed at weddings. Above it, a lacquer layer protected the reflective coating. Below, a label might be printed, though many were content with minimalist branding, as if embarrassed by their own utility. The curator's breath settles faintly on the casing. And yet, for all its technical grace, the CD remained fragile in spirit. It scratched if stared at too intently, skipped when jostled, and sometimes refused to play altogether unless rotated with the solemnity of a spinning coin on a monk's table. Despite this, it was adopted rapidly. Music lovers welcomed its crisp sound, unblemished by pops or crackles, like a conversation whispered in velvet gloves. Within a few years, the compact disc found its way into car stereos, home audio systems, and the pockets of teenagers with Discmans clipped to their belts like digital stethoscopes. Software companies soon followed, tucking their programs into jewel cases with inserts more complex than the software itself. The CD-ROM was born, a rectangular promise hidden in a circle. The sound of a plastic hinge sawing open accompanies this transition. It is strange now to think of the compact disc as revolutionary. It feels as humble as a teaspoon, capable, reliable, never once asking to be admired. Yet in its quiet competence, it changed the architecture of data. No longer did information require moving parts, magnetic tapes, or grooves carved like ancient riverbeds. It could shimmer instead like a forgotten coin in the sunlight. The compact disc taught us to trust the invisible, that behind a rainbow gleam might reside an opera, a video game, or a spreadsheet of municipal invoices from 1997. It was a triumph of invisibility, of pattern over presence. Like a librarian juggling feathers, it kept everything in motion without making a sound. And here, in the cool quiet of our museum, we preserve one of the early production prototypes, a blank disc. Pristine and untouched, its surface a mirror of intentions never fulfilled. A still moment, softly spinning in time, reflecting the silence of what might have been. A soft light filters through the archival glass, casting a faint oval onto the velvet beneath. This is where we find the compact disc not in isolation, but in proliferation, multiplying quietly, as if ashamed of its own success. The year was never announced, no trumpet declared the shift. One morning, cassette racks began to shrink. Record shelves lingered, but with less conviction. And in their place rose the unassuming disc, standing upright in translucent cases, each spine aligned like vertebrae in the plastic skeleton of retail culture. Compact discs did not boom or burst. They seeped. Into living rooms, glove compartments, bedside drawers, promotional inserts, cereal boxes. They arrived in stacks, wrapped in shrink wrap, clinging together like nervous tourists in an airport. Soon no computer, car, or stereo felt complete without a tray to receive them. The faint click of a spring-loaded door echoes softly in memory. The manufacturing of CDs became its own quiet industry, humming in climate-controlled buildings across continents. Polycarbonate pellets were melted into liquid clarity and pressed into molds bearing spiral pits, created by laser-guided stamper systems etched with original masters. These stampers were themselves made through a delicate process called glass mastering, in which glass disc, polished to near perfection, received a photoresis coating, then exposed to laser pulses that danced with the precision of a tax accountant folding origami. The developed pattern formed the negative of what would become the CD's data layer. It was electroplated with nickel, peeled, and replicated in cascading tiers of production like a bureaucratic family tree. Eventually, one stamper might lead to thousands or millions of identical discs, all bearing the exact same topography, the same silent mountain range of micropits. It was, in essence, industrial cloning performed not with urgency, but with the gentle patience of a librarian shelving forgotten books. A faint scent of ozone and plastic mingles in the air. Jewel cases, though rarely admired, played a pivotal role. Made from polystyrene, they were brittle, transparent, and unforgiving. Hinges snapped with the mournful inevitability of an arthritic knee. Booklets tucked into the front often featured lyrics, production credits, or close-ups of musicians' faces, as if to reassure the buyer that real humans had been involved. One could argue the jewel case was the final gesture of material excess before the great dematerialization began. In these years, the CD became an object of aspiration. Record stores displayed new releases like rare stamps, while magazines offered reviews not just of music, but of sound quality, mastering fidelity, and the presence or absence of hidden bonus tracks. A disc might contain a final song buried in digital silence track 99, perhaps, or a ghostly snippet accessible only by rewinding from the beginning. Like finding a note scrawled beneath wallpaper, these quirks became part of the medium's charm. The curator's shoes whisper against marble as he steps closer. The Discman, introduced by Sony, brought mobility to the format, though not without irony. While touted as portable, the earliest models skipped at the faintest provocation, betraying a temperament more suited to quiet reading rooms than subway platforms. To combat this, engineers developed anti-skip buffers, which temporarily stored data to smooth playback. This small technical adjustment gave the CD legs. So to speak, though, they walked more like a goose on stilts. Even as the audio CD flourished, the format's digital cousin emerged quietly, the CD-ROM. Here, instead of music, one found software, encyclopedias, and clip art collections of remarkable redundancy. The medium remained the same, but the content expanded into abstraction, now holding spreadsheets, search indexes, and fonts with names like Brushscript and Papyrus, each one whispering a different aesthetic misjudgment. Corporate training modules, academic libraries, government databases all entrusted their contents to a technology that was, at its heart, a mirror polished into obedience. This mirror had no preferences, no agenda. It reflected what was given, and it held it with more devotion than most interns. A static hiss of air conditioning underscores this moment. By the late 1990s, the CD had become a cultural ubiquity. Not merely a technology, but a metaphor for access. To own a collection was to possess not just music, but time itself, hours captured, organized, labeled, and arranged alphabetically or thematically depending on one's temperament. A shelf of CDs spoke volumes even when silent. It revealed taste, era, identity, sometimes shamefully, sometimes defiantly. It was not uncommon to find metallic file next to Mozart, or spoken word yoga beside Swedish death metal. There were no wrong answers, only evidence of someone trying to make sense of sound. This was the golden age of the mail-order music club. The home-burn mixtape, the scratched favorite that still played fine if you skipped the middle track. Compact discs became vessels for emotional artifacts, the breakup disc. The summer soundtrack, the road trip collection burned hastily the night before departure. Each one encoded not just data, but occasion. The whispered press of thumb on case lingers in the mind. The medium's fragility was both a flaw and a feature. A scratch could ruin a track. A warped disc refused to spin. Yet this vulnerability made the CD feel mortal, an object to be handled with care, stored vertically, never left in the sun. Unlike tapes, it had no spools to rewind, no sides to flip. Unlike vinyl, no needle to lower with trembling reverence. It demanded less ritual, but no less respect. Manufacturers, ever attuned to obsolescence as strategy, experimented with enhancements. CDR and CDRW formats allowed users to write their own data, though never with the permanence of pressed discs. Recordable CDs required special burners, which often emitted a subtle whine that resembled an electronic sigh. Many home-burned discs failed mysteriously, as if protesting the indignity of amateur authorship. A metallic flutter from a nearby exhibit hints at this resistance. As with all technology, success became its own slow undoing. With the rise of writable media came the rise of piracy, and with it, the erosion of scarcity. When every teenager could duplicate an album with a few clicks and a spindle of blanks, the compact disc began to lose its perceived weight. That which could be copied endlessly seemed to matter less. A curious inversion, as though a book's meaning faded with each reader who turned its pages. And yet, for a time, the CD held steady, not as a revolution, but as a standard. It survived attempts at improvement mini-discs, DAT, even the short-lived HD CD, all of which promised fidelity, portability, or novelty, but never quite dethroned their older sibling. The CD endured not because it was perfect, but because it was sufficient. Like a desk lamp from the 1980s, it simply worked. Here in the gallery, beside the glass case, we display a spindle of blank CDs. Still wrapped in cellophane, their edges faintly frosted, they resemble a frozen tower of possibility. Each one awaits instruction, identity, purpose. They hum quietly in anticipation, or perhaps merely in memory. The hush of archival dust settles around them. In the quiet years that followed its rise, the compact disc became something more than merely a container of sound or software. It became a fixture, the kind of object that recedes into the backdrop so thoroughly that one forgets it had to be invented at all. Like the curve of a teaspoon or the silence of an unplugged lamp, it simply was, and so it sat. On shelves, in drawers, tucked into sun visors. Perched beside fax machines and family photos, always circular, always ready, never quite asking for attention. The whispered drag of a felt sleeve passes over the surface. As its presence stabilized, the CD began to spread beyond its original purposes. Computer games once sold in cardboard boxes large enough to house a kitten now arrived in jewel cases. Their art compressed and their instruction manuals reduced to leaflets folded with almost papal precision. Educational materials, once bound in spiral notebooks and handouts, began to appear on discs. Interactive encyclopedias, pronunciation guides, geometry puzzles narrated by softly indifferent voices. It was here that a curious species of marketing began to emerge, the bonus disc. One could scarcely purchase a printer, a sound card, or even a box of cereal without receiving an accompanying CD-ROM, and offering often containing little more than trial software, customer service links, or the demo version of a puzzle game involving anthropomorphic frogs. These discs multiplied like polite rabbits in the bottom drawers of computer desks. Some came in envelopes. Others, infuriatingly, were glued into magazines with adhesive so aggressive it seemed to resent being removed. The effort required to detach them left residue on fingertips for hours, a tacky testament to promotional ambition. The sound of soft peeling and adhesive crackling fills the gallery's hush. Meanwhile, manufacturers sought to enhance the aesthetic appeal of the CD itself. A shift from silver to gold-tinted surfaces suggested a kind of subtle opulence, as though listening to Batch on a golden disc might somehow feel more refined than the same performance on standard aluminum. There were picture discs to CDs, adorned with full-color artwork that wrapped around the central hole like a carnival trapped in a porthole. None of these innovations improved sound quality, but they did offer a kind of ornamentation. Like embroidering a perfectly functional sock, they served no purpose except to amuse, and perhaps that was enough. The compact disc spread into vehicles marked a particularly delicate evolution. Car CD players, initially rare and prone to skipping over speed bumps with all the dignity of a goose on gravel, improved steadily with shock-resistant technology. The in-dash changer emerged, capable of housing 6 discs at once, though always with the risk of inserting them in the wrong slot and initiating a polite mechanical panic from which there was no return. The faint thump of a glove box closing punctuates this memory. It was also around this time that home audio systems embraced the CD with full theatricality. Stereos grew wings tall, proud speaker columns flanking center units with motorized drawers and illuminated displays. Some even offered 25-disc changers, mechanical marvels resembling lazy Susans at a librarian's banquet. One could load a week's worth of music, press shuffle, and trust the machine to choose Brahms at breakfast and disco at dusk. There was a ritual to it, the soft press of the open button, the smooth slide of the tray, the careful placement of the disc, always label up, as if the machine might recoil at an upside-down offering. The tray would retract with a subtle hum, and then, just before the music began, there was that fractional pause, the electronic equivalent of a breath. This pause became, for many, a moment of anticipation, a held note, a silence before the page turns. It was not just about the music. It was about the readiness of a machine to perform on your behalf, with no need to wind, align, or recalibrate. The CD player required only that you press play. The whisper of spinning plastic returns again, and play it did. In bedrooms, classrooms, funeral parlors. Audiobooks migrated from cassette to disc, their narrators gliding syllable by syllable into the ears of commuters and insomniacs alike. Foreign language courses were condensed into glossy box sets, promising fluency in 30 days if one only listened with sufficient posture. Ambient sound collections, rainforests, ocean tides, whale song found a natural home on compact disc, each one carefully indexed for maximum tranquility. The CD also served the humble but vital function of archiving. Families began backing up photographs, tax returns, and Christmas letters onto writable CDs, slotting them into plastic sleeves and labeling them in careful, slightly anxious handwriting. These discs were often stored in shoeboxes, then forgotten, then rediscovered years later with an almost archaeological reverence. A moment of silence stretches across the room, the sound of stacked time resting lightly beneath the glass. And then came the duplication machines, small towers of duplication used by churches, indie bands, and school districts. They allowed one to burn multiple copies of a disc simultaneously, like printing memories onto moons. Spindles of blank CDs were purchased in bulk, wrapped in tall plastic cylinders resembling ghostly jelly jars. One by one, the discs would be burned, labeled, distributed, each identical, yet somehow uniquely handled. The irony, of course, was that even as the CD reached its full cultural integration, the seeds of its obsolescence had already been planted. The rise of the MP3, a file as disembodied as breath on a window pane, offered a new model. Possession without physicality. The CD, once cherished for its portability and clarity, now seemed fussy. It took up space. It required hardware. It scratched. Digital music players, beginning with modest capacities and eccentric interfaces, eventually gained refinement. A device the size of a matchbox could hold thousands of songs, more than any spindle of discs, more than any tower of jewel cases. Portability was redefined not as the carrying of objects, but as the absence of them, and so the CD began to fade. Not with a bang, but with a soft migration. Shelves once crammed with discs were replaced with hard drives. Stores reduced their CD sections, then removed them altogether. Cars ceased installing players. Laptops followed. A faint static from the ventilation reminds us of passing time. Yet the discs themselves persisted. They did not vanish. Instead, they lingered. In thrift shops, basements, and antique malls, arranged alphabetically by someone who took the task far more seriously than necessary. A quiet dignity clung to them like pressed flowers in a dictionary. They waited not for resurgence, but for recollection. For the curious hand that might, on a sleepless night, open the case, slide in the disc, and listen once more to the gentle spin of memory returning to form. The compact disc, though mechanical in construction and mathematical in spirit, found itself increasingly pulled into the quiet gravity of memory. Not simply as a carrier of music or data, but as an object that witnessed. In its reflective silence, it captured not just audio signals or executable files, but the soft imprint of usage, the breath of hands that touched it, and the whisper of shelves upon which it rested too long. To trace its manufacturing at scale is to enter a world of precision too quiet to boast. Replication plants, often located in industrial parks behind hedges of dusty laurel, operated with the serenity of underwater cities. Here, polymer granules were melted, spun, pressed, and cooled in a choreography resembling the dreams of assembly lines, unrushed, rhythmically devout, free of improvisation. Each disc emerged with data already inside it, like a seashell containing the memory of a wave. A faint mechanical whir circles the mind like steam behind glass. Technicians monitored the process behind porthole windows. They adjusted lasers, calibrated injection molds, and examined the occasional defective pressing with the severity of monks inspecting illuminated manuscripts. There was no smell to the work, no soundtrack, only the low whine of climate control systems and the occasional static pop of an anti-static wristband. What made the CD mass replicable was the elegance of its encoding. Pits and lands, arranged along a continuous spiral, conveyed binary information not by depth but by transition. It was not the presence or absence of a pit, but the switch from pit to land or vice versa that constituted a signal. The disk spiral, if uncoiled, would stretch over 5 kilometers. An auditory ribbon wound with such density that its details could only be seen with scanning electron microscopes. A spiral worthy of a very small galaxy. During production, errors could be introduced. A speck of dust, a bubble in the lacquer, a momentary hiccup in the stamper. These faults, though rare, were watched for obsessively. Quality control engineers sampled discs and compared them to golden masters, a term with no religious connotation, yet always spoken in reverent tones. The golden master, often stored in climate-controlled darkness, represented the source, the disc from which all others were birthed. It glimmered faintly like a coin flattened by memory. The soft echo of nitrile gloves against polycarbonate lingers gently. Most listeners never thought of this process. They tore the shrink wrap, opened the case, slid the disc into a tray, and pressed play. Yet behind that action were layers of production so meticulous they bordered on sacred. One factory worker, quoted in a long-forgotten trade magazine, said of his job, "I make silence that becomes noise." And perhaps in that phrase he captured the CD's duality. But even as factories honed their output, the medium began to exhibit peculiar forms of cultural behavior. In Japan, for instance, the CD single took on elaborate packaging styles, some resembling origami, others engineered like puzzle boxes. Collectors swooned over limited editions, alternate pressings, hidden tracks, and lyric booklets printed on rice paper. These flourishes had no technical merit. They were designed to elicit feeling. A barely audible rustle of paper recalls these fragile inserts. Meanwhile, the Western world saw the rise of the enhanced CD. It promised not only audio, but data music videos, screensavers, interactive biographies. One could insert it into a stereo and hear a song, or place it into a computer and be greeted by grainy QuickTime animations and looping MIDI files. It was a transitional form, attempting to bridge the analog comfort of listening with the digital excitement of clicking. These hybrid discs rarely aged well. The data side was often finicky, the software outdated within months, and the user interface is a labyrinth of enthusiasm trapped in 800 by 600 resolution. But they represented something poignant, an effort to make the CD more than it already was, to stretch its potential before its inevitability set in. The gentle sigh of a cooling fan accompanies this observation. Meanwhile, artists and independent labels embrace the CD as their canvas. Pressing runs of 500, 1,000, or 5,000 copies became common practice. The jewel case became a miniature gallery. The disc, a token of authorship. Some printed directly on the surface with minimalist precision. Others handwrote titles with permanent markers, introducing the trembling handwriting of humanity into a mass-produced format. A particularly committed segment of listeners began curating libraries with the care of rare book collectors. Alphabetization systems were debated. Protective sleeves were purchased. CD towers, those vertical monuments to linear thinking, became home decor in and of themselves. And somewhere between ambient electronica and Baroque compilations, a kind of quiet ritual emerged, the act of selecting, removing, and replacing a disc without ever speaking. The ear hums faintly with unspoken reverence. This is the era in which the CD achieved not just utility, but permanence. It became the default. Its presence went unquestioned. Its sound was the standard against which other formats were measured. Compact discs were tucked into greeting cards that played melodies when opened. They were buried in time capsules, sealed in plastic alongside letters and candy wrappers. They were even launched into space, affixed with symbolic intent onto satellites and rovers, as if extraterrestrial life might one day decode our digital fingerprints and hear. Faintly, Celine Dion, the disc's physical vulnerability remained a constant. Despite layers of lacquer and reflective coatings, the CD was easily scratched. It developed what were ominously called laser rot and disc rot, forms of degradation whereby the metal layer oxidized or the glue between layers failed. A small, brownish spot on the surface could render entire symphonies unreadable. Preservation became a quiet anxiety. Users stored them in climate-stable rooms, avoided sunlight, and whispered warnings about coasters, fingernails, and humidity. Yet for all these risks, the compact disc endured longer than most expected. Its technical specifications were robust. It could store over 700 megabytes of data, operate across wide temperatures, and when treated gently play reliably for decades. In a world increasingly filled with ephemeral files and streaming licenses, this durability became a kind of resistance. A whisper of physicality against the tide of the invisible. Within the museum's collection, one may find an early batch of gold-layered discs manufactured with the promise of 100-year longevity. Their surface remains pristine, their data uncorrupted. They rest beside a notebook containing handwritten logs, track names, burn speeds, verification checks. Someone once trusted these objects enough to record their contents as if inscribing a will. The murmured turning of a page rustles nearby. And here, among these quiet relics, we begin to understand. The CD was never merely a vessel for music or programs. It was an architecture of trust, mass-produced. An agreement between creator and listener pressed into polycarbonate, sealed in lacquer, and delivered with neither flair nor fragility. It was the promise that if you held it properly, it would speak to you, clearly and without interruption. To observe the compact disc during its apex is to study the choreography of silence fulfilled. Every aspect of its usage, the opening of the case, the placement on the tray, the soft press of the play button contributed to a ritual that was both deeply personal and oddly universal. It was not just a format. It was a gesture, repeated quietly across millions of households, like a domestic incantation. A hush passes through the velvet curtain corridor. During this golden plateau, the CD expanded its reach beyond private consumption into public infrastructure. Libraries began loaning them as they had books and cassettes before. Listening stations appeared in record shops, small plastic booths outfitted with over-ear headphones and the faint scent of worn foam. One could sample an album before purchase, slipping the disc into a machine tethered by cable and time. There, within the tight acoustic envelope of the station, the CD whispered its content directly into your decision-making. Radio stations, too, gradually replaced turntables and cart machines with CD players, especially the dependable rack-mounted kind. DJs swapped crates of vinyl for binders of discs, each one labeled with spidery handwriting or bold neon stickers. The process was streamlined, but something else was lost. The tactile, wobbly dance of the needle was gone, replaced by a digital cue and a red LED. The sound of drawers opening and closing replaced the scratch of styluses. The curator's coat sleeve brushes softly against the edge of an unlabeled disc. In offices, the CD-ROM took hold. Installers for word processors, spreadsheets, database software, entire suites arrived on discs packed into boxes thick with multilingual manuals and the faint hope of productivity. IT departments created backup routines using CDRS. Fireproof safes were filled with disks containing nothing more than municipal water data and payroll spreadsheets. The medium's neutrality was part of its power. It stored what it was told without judgment. Governments followed suit. Archival records, tax forms, census data all quietly migrated to CDs, then to stacks of CDs, then to cabinets filled with them. A single drawer might contain every budget of a minor city from 1989 to 2004, sealed in jewel cases whose hinges had long since cracked. The medium was trusted not because it was flawless, but because it was known. Familiarity bred acceptance. The low hum of an aging CD burner stirs against the still air. By the early 2000s, the disc's domination appeared uncheckable. Portable CD players improved their buffering. Hi-Fi systems embraced multi-disc changers. Software shifted distribution models to rely almost exclusively on the format. Even the early internet relied on it. Providers mailed out installed CDs by the millions, some turning them into collectibles, others into coasters. ILO famously flooded the world with free trial CDs, saturating markets until one could barely open a mailbox without the faint glint of unsolicited connectivity winking back. The phenomenon became self-parody. People wallpapered bathrooms with their OLCDs, artists sculpted chandeliers from them. One man allegedly used them to shingle a garden shed. Their abundance became a form of ambient noise, glimmering and weightless, like snowflakes in a bureaucratic snow globe. Yet within this ubiquity lay the first signs of entropy. The lifespan of the average CD was long but not infinite, and the devices that played them began to change. Laptops, once proud to offer combination CD-DVD drives, began to shrink them away. Netbooks emerged without any disk slots at all. External drives were sold as accessories, like prosthetics for amputated expectations. MP3 players, led first by niche brands and later by a certain fruit-themed empire, began to reshape the music landscape. These devices could store hundreds, then thousands, then entire libraries of songs. The compact disc, once lauded for its portability, now seemed cumbersome. It jingled when carried. It cracked under pressure. It was loyal but high maintenance. The quiet tick of obsolescence echoed through the gallery like a metronome wrapped in wool. Artists still released albums on CD but began offering digital downloads alongside. The liner notes shrank. The cases slimmed. The inserts became perfunctory 2 panels, 1 logo, a few licensing lines. There was a sense that the object was holding on out of courtesy. Like a guest who lingers after the party, finishing their drink too slowly, unsure of how to say goodbye. Meanwhile, consumers adapted. Songs were ripped to hard drives. Music collections became folders, then libraries, then playlists. The permanence of ownership began to erode into the fluidity of access. The disc was no longer the thing, it was the intermediary, and intermediaries rarely survive revolutions. Still, there was resistance. Audiophiles, ever loyal to tangible sound, maintained that CDs offered clarity unmatched by compressed files. They cited dynamic range, signal-to-noise ratios, and jitter. Some returned to vinyl. Others stayed with CDs not out of nostalgia, but because they never saw reason to leave. They viewed the convenience of streaming with suspicion, like a librarian side-eyeing a vending machine. A soft mechanical buzz drifts from a nearby display. The environmental cost of the CD began to raise questions. Millions of discs made from non-biodegradable plastics and coated with metals, now languished in landfills or worse, were incinerated. Recycling with complex few facilities were equipped to separate their layered materials, and so they sat. Discs of forgotten training videos, obsolete antivirus software, promotional samplers, milled samplers mailed to non-existent addresses. Yet some found purpose anew. Craft circles discovered their reflective surfaces ideal for mosaics. Birdwatchers hung them from branches to deter curious magpies. Children used them as makeshift frisbees. In this, the CD achieved a second life not as a vessel of information, but as a playful detritus of the digital age. Even governments, which had once lionized the format, began issuing warnings. Do not use writable CDs for long-term archival storage. Optical decay was subtle but steady. Bit rot, reflective layer degradation, adhesive failure all inevitable in time. The very thing built to preserve data was itself susceptible to forgetting. The echo of memory unspooling rings faintly in the chamber. And yet, despite all this, some discs persisted. Lost in drawers, buried beneath receipts, hidden behind books. They waited not for redemption, but rediscovery. And when found, when dusted off and slipped into a working drive, they spun, often without complaint, as if time had paused just long enough for them to remain legible. In the next room of the museum, a CD spins silently in an old portable player. The display flickers with faint green numerals, 0 o'clock. It awaits the press of a button, the resumption of an agreement. Between disc and listener, between time and memory, between what was recorded and what still echoes. The compact disc, long past its noisy ascendance and quiet middle age, entered its era of slow withdrawal not with resistance, but with the calm of something that had already given its best. It no longer fought for relevance. It simply continued to exist discreetly, with the dignity of a hotel doorman who still wears his uniform even after the building has closed. A faint creak of archival shelving settles beneath the weight of unremembered compilations. Retail landscapes shifted. The grand CD aisles of electronic stores narrowed, then vanished. Bins once brimming with new releases became clearance corners. Record stores shuttered or downsized, their shelves emptied in exchange for download codes and prepaid digital gift cards. The physical form, the jewel case, the pressed plastic, the holographic logo on the underside was no longer necessary to deliver the thing itself. The thing, increasingly, was not a thing at all. The industry responded not with reinvention, but with packaging. Box sets arrived, heavy and elaborate, filled with remastered tracks, bonus discs, restored artwork, and retrospective essays printed on paper stock thick enough to induce mild regret. These were less listening objects than coffee table fossils designed to be seen, owned, and perhaps eventually heard. Collectors found themselves drawn not to the newest releases, but to rare pressings, foreign editions, promotional copies with odd misprints. A copy of a well-known album might be sought not for its content, but because the cover was printed in reverse, or the barcode sticker was placed diagonally by a sleepy machine in Ontario. These became talismans of a once flourishing medium, now refracted through the lens of scarcity. The whispered slip of a collector's glove brings to mind a long silent checkout beep. In parallel, a curious niche developed, the CD as artifact of a time capsule. Schools, municipalities, corporate training seminars, they had all embraced the disc as a final authority in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Now, 2 decades later, their contents seemed impossibly dated. Safety tutorials filled with Windows 98 menus. Brochures for no longer extant companies. HR policies referencing fax machines and 1.44 megabytes floppy disks. For archivists, this presented a problem. Optical drives had become scarce. The machines that once played these disks were often incompatible with modern operating systems. Drivers were missing. File formats had gone extinct. And so the task of reading a CD in the 2020s often felt less like playback and more like paleontology. A quiet click of a tray attempting to close for the first time in 10 years. The CD was not alone in this. All physical media eventually decays not just in matter, but in context. The VHS, the floppy, the zip disk, the DAT, they each had their hour. But the CD's hour had been remarkably long and uncharacteristically quiet. It had endured format wars, changing tastes, corporate mergers, and a technological migration that transformed nearly every aspect of human communication. Through it all, it never complained. It only spun. And spin it did at precise speeds, depending on the location of the laser. The inner track of the CD spun faster than the outer, allowing for a constant data rate regardless of position. This technique, known as constant linear velocity, was both elegant and efficient. It meant the disk's movement was not fixed but adaptive. Like a dancer adjusting tempo depending on the audience's attention span. The subtle whir of an aging motor hums faintly beneath the display glass. The format's technical limitations also defined its strengths. CDs were not infinite in capacity. They forced decisions. An album could not simply run forever. It had to be curated. Artists learned to sequence tracks carefully, to consider pacing, duration, and flow. The result was a resurgence of the album as an art form, a linear narrative made possible by a circular object. This also led to the emergence of hidden tracks, time silences, backwards messages. and other eccentricities made possible only because the CD's digital structure invited manipulation. It was no longer about what was visible or labeled. It was about what was embedded, waiting. In this way, the CD resembled a quiet garden with secret footpaths present, but only if you knew where to walk. Some CDs were encoded with copy protection, a last-ditch effort to preserve sales in the face of digital duplication. These measures often backfired, rendering discs unplayable in certain devices or causing computers to crash. The more one tried to control the medium, the more it resisted, as if it were gently reminding us that silence, not security, had always been its default setting. And in homes across the world, discs continued to gather dust. Some stored childhood photographs, burned hastily before hard drives crashed. Others held the only copy of a relative's voice captured during a short-lived experiment with digital dictation. A few contained half-finished projects, demos, drafts, declarations abandoned not because they failed, but because their creators moved on. The CD's great virtue, it turned out, was not permanence, but persistence. It did not guarantee that content would last forever. It only promised that, if stored well and handled gently, it might wait for you. A whisper of static memory in an otherwise forgetting world. The glint of a disc under lamplight calls back the shape of a full moon over unused filing cabinets. It became fashionable in certain circles to disparage the CD, calling it sterile, soulless, lacking the warmth of analog formats. But this criticism always rang slightly hollow. The compact disc was never trying to be warm, it was trying to be clear, to deliver sound without interruption, distortion, or decay. Its beauty lay in its restraint. And as vinyl returned to favor and streaming became the default, the CD remained in the middle, not fashionable, not revolutionary, simply functional. It became the fax machine of the music industry, still used, still valid, still misunderstood by the very generation that once worshipped its sheen. The breath of late-night radio static hovers gently in the room. Now, within the museum's quiet wing, there rests a spindle of unmarked CDs. Their surfaces are iridescent, catching gallery light in scattered fragments of remembered rainbows. No labels, no sleeves, just the potential of data waiting to be read. Like unopened letters from a world that never left, only faded slightly at the edges. Among the lesser-visited corners of technological history lies the chapter of how the compact disc became, almost incidentally, a tool of private expression. It had not been designed for such intimacy. Its origins were industrial, its shape standardized, its behavior predictable. But once released into the wilds of human ownership, it adapted. Not by changing its structure, but by allowing itself to be written on. A faint scent of permanent marker mingles with the soft dust of forgotten drawers. The CDR, or recordable compact disc, emerged quietly in the 1990s. Unlike press discs, these bore no stamped pits. Instead, they contained a dye layer, often cyanine, phyllocyanine, or azo embedded between the polycarbonate base and the reflective surface. When exposed to the focused laser of a burner, this dye underwent chemical change, altering how light was reflected in those microscopic grooves. It was not true engraving, or was it purely digital? It was somewhere in between a form of thermal calligraphy carried out by rotating light. The results were fragile, temperamental, and occasionally unreadable. But they were personal, and that made all the difference. For the first time, the average person could author a disc not in the commercial sense, but in the archival. Family photo albums migrated to CDR, high school garage bands released EPs hand-burned one by one, sometimes in friends. Basements sometimes in the back room of electronics stores where teenagers bartered for spindle packs with tenacity, usually reserved for livestock. The muted clatter of stacked jewel cases rests like quiet applause behind this recollection. Birthday parties, weddings, corporate presentations all found their way into writable discs, labeled in Sharpie, often with the kind of handwriting one only uses when trying to appear casual but legible. Some were slipped into soft sleeves. Others traveled bare, jostling in backpacks and glove compartments, collecting scratches like poorly healed memories. There were entire businesses built around duplication. Not the sterile factories of mass production, but small operations with towers of drives and a man named Rick who could burn 100 copies by Monday. For independent filmmakers, fledgling musicians, or seminar organizers, Rick was the last line between obscurity and a stack of deliverables. These discs were ephemeral by nature, unlike their pressed cousins, which could last decades if treated well. CD-RS depended on the stability of dyes and storage conditions. Heat, sunlight, or even the adhesive from certain labels could degrade them. Some lasted 20 years, others only 5. Like handwritten postcards, their lifespan hinged more on circumstance than design. A quiet ripple of heat from an overhead halogen lamp warms the air. Despite their fragility, CD-RS brought with them a wave of creativity. The act of curating a playlist, selecting tracks, adjusting volume levels, and arranging sequence gave birth to a generation of amateur producers. These were not DJs in the modern sense, but sonic diarists using compilations, CDs to express affection, apology, nostalgia, or sometimes nothing at all, just the wish to make someone pause and listen. The mix CD became the love letter of its time. Unlike a playlist, it had physical weight. One handed it over, sometimes nervously, watching the recipient's fingers graze the surface, careful not to smudge the tracks beneath. Each mix had a title, a mood, a moodier subtitle. Some had track lists. Others left it as a mystery, inviting the listener to discover the narrative embedded between carefully chosen transitions. The soft click of a jewel case closing punctuates the memory like a semicolon left in a margin. By the late 1990s, burning software grew more sophisticated. Graphical interfaces replaced command-line utilities. Nero, Roxio, and iTunes offered drag-and-drop simplicity. One could now add crossfades, fade-outs, even hidden tracks placed in the negative space before track 1 reachable only by rewinding from the beginning. A maneuver requiring both curiosity and recklessness. With greater access came a small moral panic. Schools warned students not to copy music. The music industry, watching revenue decline, launched lawsuits. Terms like piracy and intellectual property entered everyday speech, though often misunderstood. Some teenagers genuinely believed the FBI might arrive for duplicating a Dave Matthews Band album. Yet most copying was innocent, or at least innocent adjacent. Friends burned music for friends. Siblings made road trip mixes. CD burners were expensive at first, then became ubiquitous. Spindles of blank discs were sold in supermarkets beside printer paper and dish soap. They were no longer a tool for preservation or production. They were simply part of the domestic landscape. The reflective underside of these discs revealed subtle colorations, green, blue, gold depending on the dye used. This added a layer of aesthetic randomness. Some claimed the green ones lasted longer. Others preferred the blue for its moody shimmer. In truth, none knew for certain and most didn't care. The point wasn't perfection. The point was control. A faint glimmer from a pile of unlabeled discs catches the curator's eye. As the new millennium unfolded, the CD-RW arrived writable and, in theory, more sustainable, yet it never found the same affection. There was something unsettling about erasing and overwriting. The permanence of a burned disc, even if flawed, offered a kind of comfort. The CD-RW, with its invitation to revision, felt less honest, like whispering a promise and then taking it back. Eventually, as USB drives gained storage and streaming became ubiquitous, the mixed CD began to fade. Not disappear dash, just ... soften. Like a photograph left near a window, it lost contrast slowly, until the image blurred into mere suggestion. One could still burn a disc, of course. The software still existed. The blank media could be found in clearance bins, but the urgency was gone. And so the CDR, once a revolution, now rests quietly in old shoeboxes and desk drawers. It wears the patina of past relevance, no longer asked to perform, yet not discarded either. Occasionally, someone finds one, reads the label, inserts it into an external drive, waits. And when it spins and plays and echoes, they're reminded not only of the content but of themselves at the moment of creation. Here in the gallery, a rotating display showcases a fan of handwritten, mixed CDs. Their titles are cryptic. Fall Vibes 2003, Drive to Nowhere, for E. Each bears the smudge of thumbprints, the uneven pressure of a felt-tip pen. They are not perfect objects. They are fragments of imperfect intentions, preserved not because they matter broadly, but because they mattered once. And that, for the CD, was always enough. By the time the compact disc reached its cultural twilight, its ubiquity had become nearly invisible. The disc that once shimmered like a technological marvel had grown ordinary, resting in glove compartments, behind microwaves, under beds. It no longer turned heads. It simply turned quietly when asked, like an aging butler who knew the family better than they knew themselves. A slow exhale brushes through the archival chamber's artificial air. Yet even in this dusk light of relevance, the CD refused to vanish. It endured in the margins at flea markets, church rummage sales, thrift shops. There, among chipped mugs and VHS tapes, stood boxes labeled in faded marker, $1 each or 5 for $3. Their contents chaotic, democratic. One might find Paco Bell beside Pantera, a meditation album nestled beside Microsoft Office 2000. The disorder was oddly comforting. The phenomenon of the used CD store became its own quiet subculture. These shops, often dimly lit and faintly musty, offered narrow aisles and endless racks of jewel cases arranged in categories so specific they bordered on spiritual taxonomy. Post-Britpop, pre-remastered Bowie, soundtracks, films no one remembers. Customers flip through alphabetized trays with a soft click-click-click rhythm, like a librarian rifling through thoughts. A creaking floorboard completes the phrase. These stores were not simply retail spaces. They were mausoleums of format memory. Each disc held not just its content, but the fingerprint of its previous owner, sometimes literally. Stickers, residue, cracked hinges, spines faded from years on a sunlit shelf. Some still bore the shrink wrap, unopened since their initial purchase, as though their purpose had always been to wait. Collectors began to gravitate not to the newest or rarest, but to the oddly specific. A limited run from a failed label. Original release with a misprinted track list. Japanese imports with lyric translations that read like surrealist poetry. These were no longer just music, they were physical footnotes in the chaotic novel of media history. Meanwhile, in unexpected places, the CD lingered out of sheer functionality. Government agencies, bound by procurement inertia, continued to issue public records on CD-ROMs. Small-town DMV offices burned appointment logs onto discs, labeling them with a ballpoint pen and optimism. In basements and back rooms, dusty desktop towers whirred to life once more, not because they were preferred, but because they still worked. A soft thrum of a 52X drive spins up somewhere behind the display wall. The automotive world held on longer than most. Car manufacturers continued including CD players in vehicles well into the streaming age. Not because demand was high, but because supply chains moved slowly and change is expensive. For years, one could buy a new car with no cassette deck, no auxiliary input, and no Bluetooth-only thin slot that accepted a disc with all the solemnity of a confession. Eventually, even this changed. CD players vanished from dashboards. In their place, touchscreens, subscriptions, cloud integrations. The disc had no port of entry. It became luggage with no station, a key to a door already bricked over. The hollow click of an unused eject button echoes faintly from a museum-staged console. Yet the CD's exile from the mainstream only made its presence more surreal. Artists began releasing new music on compact disc again, not in hopes of massive sales, but a symbolic gesture. The disc became a token of intentionality. This is a real album, the format seemed to say. It has weight. You may hold it. You may place it somewhere and remember that you did. Indie labels began issuing CDs in hand-assembled packaging envelopes, stitched booklets, recycled cardboard sleeves. These were not mass market. They were pilgrim objects made with care for the few who cared, like a zine stapled by candlelight. And for all its decline, the compact disc remained one of the few physical media formats still fully user-creatable. Unlike vinyl, which required costly pressing, or cassettes, which suffered from limited fidelity and magnetized spite, the CD could be burned in a dorm room, labeled in a kitchen, and handed to someone on a park bench. It asked no permission. As such, it became strangely resilient in niche communities. DMOS, bootlegs, fan compilations all found refuge in the humble CD. The underground survived not in clouds, but in jewel cases carried in backpacks with scuffed corners and hand-drawn cover art. The whisper of graphite on matte paper recalls this modest rebellion. In educational contexts, too, the CD lingered like a polite guest who doesn't know the party ended. Language courses, university lectures, test prep materials all continued to ship with discs. Some contained PDFs, others spoken drills. A few required outdated media players or plugins that browsers no longer supported, yet they were included, perhaps out of habit, perhaps as apology. Even the entertainment industry couldn't fully let go. Certain video games shipped on discs well into the age of digital downloads. Film soundtracks, re-released and remastered, found homes in collector's editions. Audiobooks, long displaced by apps, still circulated on CD for libraries and long-haul truckers who found comfort in consistency. Here in the museum, one finds a small collection titled Stubborn Formats. It includes zip discs, mini discs, and of course, the CD. Each one rests in a drawer labeled with the year of its supposed extinction. Each one, when tested, still functions. The soft glint of a disc turning in a tray marks the passage of neither time nor trend, but something quieter. Usefulness unbothered by fashion, and in this way the compact disc persists. Not loudly, not centrally, but loyally. In junk drawers, secondhand stores, and glove compartments. In private collections organized by mood rather than alphabet. In the mind of a stranger who once burned a mix for someone they never quite confessed to. In the gentle thrill of rediscovery, because in the end the CD was never just a medium. It was an anchor. A small circle of stillness in a world that moved too quickly, a mirror that played sound when asked kindly, and remembered sometimes better than we did. By now, the compact disc had entered a phase of existence best described as peripheral. It neither protested its fading relevance nor sought reinvention. It remained, as some objects do, simply because nothing had asked it to leave forcefully enough. Like a cat asleep on an unused armchair, the CD waited for someone to remember why it had once mattered. A whisper of static settles across an untouched stereo system. In the twilight of its commercial era, the CD became what all technology eventually becomes: ritual. Not necessity, not dominance ritual. Audiophiles spoke of it in terms of signal paths and mastering compression. Collectors curated shelves by genre, label, pressing origin, and disc metrics codes, as though building cathedrals from plastic and code. And then, quite curiously, it began to resurface not in boardrooms or product launches, but in bedrooms, forums, and corners of online resale sites where nostalgia was not a marketing strategy but a private ache. There, among VHS fan edits and cassette revivalists, a new generation began to ask, what if we just listen to CDs again? This was not retro chic. It was not accompanied by vinyl's aesthetic renaissance or the ironic winks of Polaroid cameras. It was quieter than that. Quieter even than the format itself. A generation raised on streaming on invisible libraries and algorithmic. Playlists found something grounding in the act of selecting a disc, holding it to the light, placing it gently in a tray, and hearing it begin. A soft rotation hums against the padded enclosure of memory. What they discovered was something older listeners had taken for granted: the finitude of attention. A compact disc plays from beginning to end. One track follows another. There is no shuffle unless invited. There is no endless scroll. No skip unless intentional. It is a medium of commitment, of presence. And in an age of digital overwhelm, presence became its own form of luxury. The tactile qualities played their part. Jewel cases, once derided for their fragility, now offer comfort through their predictability. The sound of one opening, the soft creak, the subtle pop of plastic became an invocation. The booklet, often ignored in its heyday, now drew eyes. Lyrics printed in size 9 font, production credits, grainy promotional photos. They were not ephemera. They were part of the experience. Record stores, sensing this subterranean shift, began to restock CDs not as a full revival, but as a shelf's worth of cautious hope. New releases appeared in limited runs. Reissues were pressed with loving liner notes and remastered audio that promised warmth, clarity, and dynamic range. The phrase "loudness war" re-entered conversations in hushed tones, like the name of a battle fought in a dream. The faint rustle of a shrink-wrapped sleeve being peeled away murmurs beneath this reflection. Online communities formed around CD preservation and discussion. Entire threads debated Japanese pressings versus early European masters. Some tracked down rare editions by matrix codes etched into the inner ring. Others hunted Target discs' early runs with minimalist design and rare mixes. The CD, once dismissed as sterile and characterless, was rediscovered as subtle and specific, like discovering that your accountant used to write poetry. And while vinyl crackled and hissed its way into boutique cafes and DJ crates, the CD remained content in its anonymity. It did not seek the spotlight. It did not demand curated Instagram posts or audiophile cred. It offered silence where needed, fidelity where desired, and just enough resistance to reward intention. There were obstacles, of course. Modern laptops lacked drives. Cars no longer accepted discs. External players had to be purchased or dug out from storage, often with missing cables or half-charged batteries. But these inconveniences, rather than deterring interest, added to the charm. To listen to a CD now was to mean it. A quiet thump from an old remote control, still functional, completes the scene. Some embraced older hardware, vintage boomboxes, component stereos, 5-disc changers with motorized trays that whirred like polite robots returning from retirement. Others sought out modern CD player sleek, compact devices manufactured by companies that never stopped believing in lasers and plastic. In parallel, artists began to recognize the CD as a mode of communication distinct from streaming. Some released exclusive tracks on disc. Others included handwritten notes or signed inserts. Bandcamp sellers offered bonus content on CD-RS, mailed in envelopes with stamps and tape, and the thrilling uncertainty of analog logistics. For certain genres, the CD had never left. Classical music, ambient, and certain jazz circles remain loyal due to the format's noise floor and capacity for dynamic expression. In these spaces, a 76-minute performance pressed onto a single disc felt less like a limitation and more like a canvas. The whispered glide of a silk program guide brushes gently against the moment. Museums, too, began to take notice. Not of the CD's novelty, but of its ordinariness. Exhibitions featured early prototypes, marketing materials, promotional stands from defunct retailers. Histories were written not just of invention, but of adoption. How a mere disc became part of domestic life, how it shaped behavior, how it faded. These were not nostalgia exhibits. They were acknowledgments of an object's place in the choreography of late 20th century culture. And still, in homes across the world, discs remain. Some alphabetized, some loose in drawers. Some hidden inside players that haven't been opened since last winter. Their presence is neither urgent nor obsolete. It simply continues. Like the quiet pulse of a nightlight in an otherwise empty room. Because the compact disc, more than a carrier of sound or data, was a structure. A structure for choosing, holding, playing, and listening. It required only that you ask it kindly. And in return, it gave you everything it had, without buffering, without logging in, without asking for more than your attention. Here in the final case of this hallway, one CD spins lazily in a glass-covered tray. It plays nothing. It simply turns as though remembering. The hum is faint but steady. the sound of presence without performance, the sound of a technology that never needed to be more than it was. In the study of forgotten formats, one must learn to distinguish between what is obsolete and what is merely overlooked. The compact disc having weathered trends, transitions, and torrential predictions of its demise, found itself in the strange position of being too recent to be antique and too old to be essential. It floated, not unlike a forgotten bar of soap in the back of a drawer, intact, useful, slightly dusty, and somehow always in the way. A delicate vibration of shelving settles with the weight of 6 alphabetized box sets. This transitional state, neither here nor gone, offered a peculiar freedom. No longer burdened by mass expectations, the CD became a vessel for the specific. Micro-labels emerged, pressing small batches of albums for niche audiences, field recordings of Icelandic ice melt, 14th century lute transcriptions, minimalist drone symphonies lasting the full 80-minute capacity of the disc. These were not commercial gambits, they were offerings. Like a message in a bottle sent across a very dry sea. Some artists recorded exclusively to CDR, embracing the impermanence of die-based storage as a form of poetic decay. These were sold hand-to-hand at performances, wrapped in craft paper, sealed with wax, or stuffed into repurposed DVD cases. Each one slightly irregular, slightly smudged, slightly hopeful. The muted press of foam padding inside a mailer envelope echoes faintly in the room. Elsewhere, the CD found unlikely companions in the world of documentation. Small-town historical societies, underfunded and over-organized, began transferring old photos, scanned newsletters, and oral histories to CD-ROM. These discs, labeled in Comic Sans and stored in school supply boxes, became time capsules for memories too minor for cloud storage and too specific for YouTube. One disc might contain 3 hours of interviews with former residents of a town known for its turnip festivals. Another, a slideshow of dogs from a 1999 agility competition, complete with mighty background music and transitions shaped like rotating stars. In these recordings lived the texture of everyday memory, neither great nor profound, but thick with living detail. A faint digital chime flickers from an outdated slideshow viewer. In hospitals and medical archives, the CD remains surprisingly present. Radiology departments burned scans onto disks long after cloud systems were implemented, partly out of compliance, partly out of inertia. Patients were handed their own insides, encoded onto shimmering circles with anonymous file names, IMG_45321, DCM. The irony, of course, was rich your future, your body, your prognosis, all fitting neatly into a jewel case with no label and no instructions. Education, too, retained a minor dependency. Language learning kits sold on CD long after apps supplanted them, especially for libraries and older learners. The voice of a cheerful narrator, repeat after me, "Oh, est la bibliothèque?" echoed through countless living rooms, carried by lasers that hadn't been cleaned in years. The median may have been old. The French was older. A quiet tongue click of a language CD being returned to its sleeve completes the scene. Even in the realm of piracy, the CD had evolved. Not just for music or software anymore, but for bootleg concert recordings. Rare radio sessions and unreleased demos collected by fans with more time than sense. These discs circulated through trade networks by mail, wrapped in lined notebook paper, accompanied by courteous notes written in the grammar of trust. Let me know if you get errors. Burned at 4x to be safe. There were rules in this world. No selling. No MP3 re-encoding, no writing on the label side. The community functioned with a strangely monastic discipline, and the CD was its sacrament. Fragile, circular, luminous, a wafer of shared devotion. Meanwhile, in households around the world, the CD clung to usefulness. Children's storybooks came with audio discs narrated by honey-voiced actors. Exercise programs sold on infomercials still included CD companions, tracking routines, and motivational speeches that now echoed eerily in storage basements. Tax preparation software arrived in padded envelopes, accompanied by cheery user guides printed in colors no longer legally recognized. And the format's physicality once its burden became its charm. A CD could be lent, borrowed, gifted, displayed, hidden. It could be signed by a band, marked with a lipstick kiss, or stored in a sock drawer next to unsent letters. It had weight. You could leave it on someone's dashboard or under their pillow or halfway through a breakup conversation. You could scratch it by accident or on purpose. Either way, it would remember. Here in the quieter galleries of the museum, one finds a listening alcove. A CD player sits embedded in a wooden console. Headphones hang from brass hooks. A tray holds a selection of discs, some commercial, some handmade, all unlabeled. Visitors are encouraged to choose one at random, press play, and sit. Most selections are odd: a poetry reading in Finnish, a sleep meditation recorded on cassette and burned in 2002, a jazz solo performed entirely on bass clarinet. But occasionally, someone selects a disc and hears exactly what they needed. Not because the music is perfect, not because it is rare, but because it begins, it continues, and it ends without buffering, without advertisements, without the need to click anything at all. A flicker of green from the player's display settles into the room like dusk through frosted glass. And so the compact disc endures not just as a medium, but as a rhythm. Insert, play, listen, remove, return. It is not flashy. It is not infinite. But it is enough. A finite space for sound offered with dignity. A rotation completed not in glory, but in stillness. As the digital tide rose and the shoreline of physical media receded, the compact disc remained like a seashell left, just above the foam line, dull to some, iridescent to others, and quietly resonant to those who bothered to lift it to their ear. It no longer competed. It simply continued. A faint rustle of felt-lined drawers being opened and shut punctuates the calm. One might have assumed that with the advent of streaming, the CD's role as a delivery mechanism was finished. But technology has a strange way of doubling back on itself. Like a retired librarian called in to explain the filing system no one remembered inventing, the CD returned not as the future, but as a reminder of how the past had once been legible. Some of this resurgence came from frustration. Streaming, for all its reach, is impermanent. Catalogs shift. Albums disappear. Tracks are re-uploaded with changes, remasters, edits, licensing revisions. The song you loved may not sound the same tomorrow. The CD, by contrast, was stubborn. Once pressed, it did not evolve. Its glitches were fixed only by skipping. Its clarity was not subject to bandwidth. Its presence was not conditional. The soft, definitive clack of a disc being seated in a tray affirms this certainty. For archivists and audio engineers, the format's virtues became newly apparent. CDs offered uncompressed, lossless audio with measurable parameters. They could be ripped, analyzed, tagged, and stored with confidence. In professional circles, early CD pressings of certain albums became benchmarks used not for nostalgia, but as technical reference points. A flat transfer of a master, untouched by later enhancements or compression, became a prized possession. At the same time, niche markets stabilized. Independent artists began issuing physical copies not for mass sales, but for connection. Touring bands, ambient composers, experimental collectives, these groups found that a well-made CD sold at a performance or mailed by hand created a bond. Fans didn't just buy music. They received an object, held it, read the liner notes on a train, forgot it in a coat pocket, found it again 3 years later, and smiled. The whisper of glossy cardstock unfolding fills the gallery's quiet. In Japan, the CD never truly vanished. Major artists continued to release albums on the format, with packaging more elaborate than ever: multiple booklets, bonus discs, obi strips, slipcases. The physicality was celebrated. Not as resistance to change, but as an extension of aesthetic. One did not just listen. One unwrapped, inspected, experienced. The object was part of the music. Europe saw its own pockets of persistence. In Germany, certain classical and jazz labels maintained pristine catalogs on CD, prized for their engineering and production standards. In Scandinavia, folk music releases on compact disc continued uninterrupted, distributed at festivals and sold at museum gift shops beside birch spoons and local honey. These were not eccentric holdouts. They were ecosystems quiet, enduring, and softly humming in the background. Elsewhere, libraries faced a dilemma. Their shelves still held thousands of CDs, borrowed steadily by patrons with card players or old boomboxes or an aversion to login screens. But replacement copies were rare. Disc repair machines were temperamental. And yet, no librarian could quite bring themselves to discard a fully functional batch box set or a recording of rural bird calls annotated by someone named Sven. The mechanical sigh of a disc repair buffer laps gently at the edge of memory. The secondhand market, once a graveyard, became a garden. Used CD prices rose slightly but meaningfully. Rarity returned. Albums long out of print were hunted with patient precision. A small but steady industry of resellers emerged, photographing spines, listing matrix codes, rating case condition, and debating jewel case variants with all the fervor of Victorian botanists sketching leaf patterns. Digital databases once focused solely on LPs and cassettes now integrated CD catalogs with detailed entries. Discogs became a haven not just for record collectors, but for jewel case archaeologists. The format was no longer an afterthought. It was a chapter coherent, finite, and worthy of footnotes. And in homes less defined by curation, the CD player made quiet returns. Elderly parents reconnected with long-lost opera compilations. Teenagers received hand-burned mixes from older siblings with notes like "play in order" and "don't laugh." College students scoured thrift shops for Y2K era curiosities, giggling at bands with frosted hair and font choices that resembled dental trauma. The dry, papery squeak of a thrift store price tag being peeled from a jewel case interrupts the scene. In the silence between these interactions, something persisted. The trustworthiness of the CD's design. It never demanded connection to the internet. It did not expire, nag, or shuffle. It offered no suggestions. It merely waited lightweight, unblinking, circular, and spun when asked. Some remembered that the format had once included more than music. Encyclopedias, dictionaries, travel guides all distributed on CDR-O-Miz. Their interactive animations and 256 color graphics now faintly laughable, yet also soothing. These digital relics, once cutting edge, now served as time capsules, a how-to for navigating optimism. Here in the far corner of the gallery sits an old desktop machine monitor, tower, speakers, all intact. The disk drive has been repaired, the OS frozen in amber. Visitors may load any disk from the case beside it. Choices include Europe by Rail 1998, Encyclopedia of Dog Breeds, and Virtual Volcano Explorer. The mouse clicks slowly, the animations load like molasses, and the voice is cheerful, robotic, earnest to describe things no one asks about anymore, but people listen anyway. Because the CD, despite everything, still plays, still works, still holds. Not because we need it, but because it has never stopped offering. And there is perhaps a kind of grace in that, an object that asks for nothing but time and in return gives it back in sound. There comes a moment in the life cycle of every technology when its continued presence begins to feel like a small act of rebellion. Not loud, not hostile, merely persistent. The compact disc, with its soft sheen and quiet discipline, settled into this role like a cat who has never once acknowledged being replaced. It no longer needed to justify its existence. It only needed to exist. A distant tick of a loading tray returns to its rest state, barely audible beneath museum glass. In the years following its cultural retreat, the CD acquired a quality it had never previously owned: mystery. For younger generations, those raised on frictionless streams and algorithmic feeds, the disc posed questions. What was it like to buy an album you hadn't heard? To read lyrics while listening? To wait until track 9 just to find out what it sounded like? To not know precisely what came next? The answers lived not in theory, but in action, and so some began to find players. External drives with bright blue LEDs, dusty boom boxes from attics. Stereo receivers found on curbs, adopted and reconnected like elderly relatives with still functioning opinions. The tactile ritual became a novelty. Unwrapping the case, pressing a tray, watching the disc vanish, magic in slow motion. A faint motor winds cycles down into silence. For others, the compact disc became a solution to modern fatigue. In a world of endless options, the CD had boundaries. You could listen to this album or you could stop. You could not shuffle the entire world. You could not fall into an infinite scroll. You could press play, hear a song, then hear the next one. That was all. It was enough. This fixedness, once a limitation, now felt strangely liberating. It returned control not by offering more choices, but by removing them. Like a well-made bench in a crowded park, the CD invited stillness without expectation. Academic interest followed. Researchers studying media history began to treat CDs not just as artifacts, but as text. They analyzed early mastering levels, tracked changes across pressings, and compared international editions. Some even reconstructed the genealogy of album reissues following how a single piece of music changed over time, in compression, EQ balance, liner notes, and even font kerning. The gentle scrape of a paper sleeve being removed joins the ambient air. Collectors, emboldened by this reappraisal, began documenting their libraries. Lists circulated. Ratings were debated. Forums lit up with questions like, is the 1985 West German pressing of Brothers in Arms superior to the Japanese first edition? The answer mattered less than the inquiry. It was not about winning. It was about listening closely. Meanwhile, in the realm of pure function, the CD retained one final stronghold, the long drive. For those without streaming data, without cables, without patience for Bluetooth tantrums, the disc offered something priceless: reliability. Insert. Play. No buffering. No ads, no notifications. Only road and music, stitched together by track numbers and the landscape outside. A steady rhythm of mile markers joins the cadence of a disc changing tracks. And then there was the artwork. Once an afterthought for many, it now gained new gravity. The 12-centimeter square of printed material became a site of concentration. Some designs used negative space. Others hid cryptic messages beneath tray linings. A few unfolded into posters. In one instance, widely admired but rarely replicated, a fold-out insert contained a recipe for mushroom stew, scrawled in the artist's own hand. The CD, it seemed, had been preparing for its cult status all along. Even more surprising was the return of the format in unexpected genres. Ambient artists, noise musicians, and DIY labels rediscovered the CD as the perfect vessel: affordable, durable, immediate. A run of 50 discs, burned at home and slipped into stamped cardboard sleeves, could circulate among listeners like sacred contraband. No streaming service would ever index them. No algorithm would recommend them. They existed outside the great sorting machine, and perhaps that was the CD's final form, the opt-out object. In an age of surveillance, of constant digital visibility, the disc offered no metrics, no likes, no skip rates. No completion percentages. It simply played or it didn't. It didn't care if you were multitasking. It didn't pause when you left the room. It kept spinning. The faint rotational hum of a disc without an audience still exists in the soundscape of human attention. In a modest listening room tucked behind the main gallery sits a display marked simply "Unremarkable CDs." The collection includes a 2014 pop sampler from a Dutch supermarket, a corporate wellness CD issued by a regional bank, a spoken word poetry album featuring the voice of someone's uncle. Visitors are invited to listen, most decline. Some choose one at random and sit, eyes closed. And sometimes they do not open them again until track 6. For the compact disc was never about discovery in the algorithmic sense. It was about arrival. About setting aside the impulse to search and surrendering instead to duration, to sequence, to whatever happened next, because there is something quietly profound in that surrender. and saying, I will listen to this whole thing before I decide. I will sit with it even if I don't like it until it finishes speaking, and then perhaps I will understand. And so the CD, nearly forgotten by progress, now rests in a different kind of relevance, not for everyone, not always. But for those who choose it, it remains steady, unflashy, ready. In the waning light of its mainstream era, the compact disc did not vanish. It simply ceased to announce itself. It became finally what it had always performed best as background. Not in the sense of being irrelevant, but in the sense of being there when needed, not when demanded. Like a trusted appliance in a rarely used guest room plugged in, dusted occasionally, and somehow always working. A soft ambient tone pulses faintly behind museum glass, steady as a pulse no one checks anymore. The final stages of CD manufacturing continued with quiet diligence long after the format as cultural momentum had dispersed. Replication plants, once massive and humming with the sound of 24-hour production cycles, downsized. Some closed. Others adapted. A few shifted entirely to pressing archival data, medical imaging, or small batch releases for bands whose fan bases measured in the hundreds, but who knew, with unwavering clarity, that 100 copies was exactly enough. Equipment was sold off piecemeal. High-speed burners, zampers. Lacquer machines, each once the backbone of global distribution, were auctioned to hobbyists, boutique labels, and in one notable case, a sculptor who turned defective discs into a kinetic sculpture shaped like a collapsing planetarium. The slow rotation of one mirrored disc over another cast faint kaleidoscopic light across the whitewashed wall. Elsewhere, libraries began boxing up their CD collections. Not in anger nor haste, but out of a sense of rotation. The discs had served well. Some, worn to the faintest rainbow at the edges, were quietly discarded. Others entered archive storage. A few were adopted by patrons, offered free on rainy days beside a cardboard sign, "Please give them a home." Many did. Car manufacturers stopped including CD players altogether. Not as a decision, but as a concession. The shift had already occurred in practice. Smartphones connected wirelessly. Dashboards became screens. Navigation, music, communication all fed through one portal. The CD offered none of this. It could only spin. And so it ceased to be offered. Still, the secondhand market held steady. Online listings grew, not rapidly, but consistently. A wave of disc resellers emerged, not professionals, not specialists, but ordinary individuals trimming their collections or rediscovering old stock. Each listing was its own narrative. Excellent condition, barely played. Case cracked, disc perfect. Found this in a box, not sure if it still works. The soft flicker of a scanner light across a jewel case illuminates the label like a name tag on a long-retired employee. And all the while the discs themselves endured. Not because they had nowhere to go, but because they asked for so little. They could be boxed, stored, forgotten, rediscovered. Played, replayed, they neither degraded like tape nor warped like vinyl. They neither demanded updates nor vanished from license. They were what they were. Perfectly, precisely, sufficiently themselves. In households across the world, CD towers remained sometimes empty, sometimes converted into towel racks, sometimes still full. Some were organized alphabetically, others chronologically, a few idiosyncratically. Things I listened to while unemployed, discs that made me cry once, burned mixes from people I don't speak to anymore. The whispered clink of plastic on plastic arranges these memories without commentary. There were signs of resilience. New players entered the market, not high-end, not luxurious, but sufficient. Small tabletop units, boomboxes with Bluetooth and CD slots, retro-styled mini-systems that invoked the early 2000s with padded buttons and blue-lit displays. They did not pretend to innovation. They offered familiarity. Artists, increasingly skeptical of streaming revenue, began once again pressing limited CD runs, signing inserts, numbering cases, mailing packages with notes. The transactions were not profitable in the traditional sense, but they were rich in something else. the slow reestablishment of presence, of knowing someone opened what you sent, held it, and listened. And then there was the software, long forgotten programs, once shipped by disk, now accessible only through the hardware they required. Vintage computer collectors kept CD-ROMs alive not just as data, but as keys to lost worlds, educational games, operating systems, clip art suites containing thousands of anthropomorphic vegetables. These relics, absurd and beautiful, found caretakers, not for what they did, but for what they once allowed. A faint keystroke registers from the beige keyboard of an obsolete machine still capable of miracles. As the CD approached the edge of its historical function, it revealed what it had truly always been, a bridge between analog and digital, between ownership and access, between the tangibility of the past and the virtualization of the present. It was never intended to last forever, and yet it had lasted far longer than anyone planned. Not because it resisted change, but because it changed nothing about itself. It remained quiet, precise, durable, honest. Here, in the final room of the museum's linear wing, sits a spindle of unmarked CDRs. They are blank, still wrapped. Their surfaces shimmer under soft LED lighting with the same diffidence they've always shown. A small placard reads, estimated lifespan under proper conditions, 30 to 100 years. Whether this is hope or threat remains undecided. The compact disc, having passed through invention, innovation, dominance, decline, and drift, rests now in an uncommon state, equilibrium. It is not dead. It is not thriving. It simply is. There is a moment late at night when the house is still, and even the refrigerator has quieted, when one becomes aware of the softest things. The faint creak of furniture remembering weight, the distant hum of something cooling, the presence of an object not currently in use, yet undeniably there. The compact disc belongs to this moment, now not in volume or brightness, but in its willingness to remain. A nearly inaudible rotation of imagined motions stirs the air like breath on cold glass. We no longer need the CD in the way we once did. That much is certain, and yet we keep it, not for performance, not even always for nostalgia, but for what it represents, a kind of trust. A material promise that the thing we love, the album, the voice, the program will be there when summoned, unchanged by time, unedited by unseen hands, uninterrupted by buffering or decisions we did not make. In this way, the CD became accidentally a form of resistance. Not political, not loud, but a quiet assertion of permanence in a world that increasingly prefers the soft dissolve of impermanence. Everything now streams. Everything updates. Nothing holds still. The CD, by contrast, holds. It spins when asked, and when not asked, it simply waits. Like a letter never sent, sealed but sincere. We do not think of it this way often. Most of the time, the CD is just a shape, a relic, a faintly comedic object in a drawer with expired cables. But if we examine it more closely, not technically, but symbolically, it begins to reveal other things. Its form is a circle, not accidental, not decorative, a shape with no beginning and no end. It spins to be read, not from the outside in like a record, but from the center outward in expansion rather than a return. The data it holds is encoded in reflections, not carvings. It is a mirror that speaks only to light. There is poetry in this. A disc that sings not by vibrating, but by being seen. A technology that asks for attention without force and gives its memory back in sound. The hush of a light beam touching polycarbonate echoes through the architecture of presence. We designed it to be efficient, yes, but efficiency was never the whole story. We wrapped it in cases. We printed artwork. We numbered the tracks. We gave it rituals, remove from shelf, open, press tray, insert, close, listen. These were gestures of engagement. They asked us to be there not only as consumers, but as participants in the act of listening. Streaming, by contrast, erases ritual. It makes music frictionless, infinite, ever-shifting. This has its beauty. But it also untethers us from the weight of the thing. The CD, for all its limits, gives us edges. It says, this is the album. It is this long. It begins here. It ends there. It cannot continue past itself. There is in that a kind of mercy, and more than that, there is privacy. A compact disc does not report back. It does not log your habits, suggest alternatives, or track your mood. It does not sell your ears to advertisers. It spins. It finishes. That is all. Its silence is its gift. A slight indentation in the foam lining of a jewel case records the echo of this unspoken agreement. In this way, the CD resembles other forgotten things, books borrowed in silence, maps folded and refolded, letters with corners rounded by time, objects that do not demand attention but offer it, that do not pulse or chirp or buzz but wait, that keep their shape even when we have not visited them in years. Perhaps this is why, for some, the return to the compact disc is not about retro appeal or sound quality or nostalgia. It is about boundaries. In a world where everything blurs content, interface, format, the CD is blunt. This, not that. Now, not later. This track, then the next. If you want to listen again, you must press repeat. It will not assume. Its limitations are not flaws. They are features. Designed not to frustrate, but to focus. When we say the CD has no distractions, we mean it offers nothing except what it holds. And in that singularity, something rare occurs. We listen. Not because it is efficient, but because it is present. There is something else too, something quieter. In its physicality, the CD carries time differently. It can be given. It can be lost. It can be found. It can hold fingerprints. It can smell faintly of a place. It can snap. It can be scratched. And even then it sometimes plays. Like memory itself, imperfect but insistent. You cannot misremember a stream. It is gone the moment it ends. But a compact disc left in the wrong case, returned to the wrong shelf, rediscovered 10 years later with a scribbled label, Mixed Jan '06, can stop you. Not just because of what's on it, but because of when it was made and how it got to now. These are not accidents. They are affordances of form. The CD quietly gives shape to time. Not linear, not clean, but material, weighty, and in its own way, kind. In the penultimate alcove of the museum, a visitor finds a bench, a portable CD player, and a row of discs marked only by year. There are no instructions. You may sit. You may choose. You may listen, or you may not. The player's screen glows with a soft 0 o'clock, awaiting the press of play like the inhale before a held note. We have walked a long circle. From polymers and lasers, to supermarkets and dashboards, to drawers, discographies, and digital drift. The compact disc, it turns out, was never just a medium. It was a pause pressed into plastic, mirrored, numbered, labeled, a method of slowing time, of making memory circular, and of letting the act of listening become an act of choosing. A hush stirs behind the last curtain, the sound of nothing being announced. The museum holds no illusions of permanence. All things fade. All formats fracture. History is the story of use giving way to memory, and memory settling quietly into dust. But not yet, not here. Because even now, even as we finish, the compact disc remains not in rebellion, but in stillness. The kind of stillness only found in objects that no longer compete, but simply wait. In a world increasingly orchestrated by unseen code, the CD offers its defiant transparency. You can hold it to the light and see how it works. A spiral of tiny refracted decisions. Each pit and land, each reflected flicker becomes sound not through mystery, but through design. It asks to be read, not interpreted. It resists the fashionable impulse to obscure. A soft touch of a thumb against the edge of a jewel case pauses the thought, as though hesitant to close the chapter still echoing. And yet, even this clarity is not sterile. Because between the tracks, between the folds of liner notes, between the burn speed and the scrawled label, something else lived. The CD gave us not just content, but shape to attention, to ritual, to time. It required hands. It rewarded pause. It offered a finish. This is why it stayed. Not because it was trendy or flawless or rare, but because it fulfilled its promise with such discretion. It delivered without noise. It remained without pleading. It spun and spun and spun until it was finished and stopped. We do not mourn it. We do not need to. The compact disc does not ask for elegy. It asks only that, once in a while, we open the case, insert the tray, and listen. Not because we must, but because we may. And in this permission, it grants something rare: time returned on demand without commentary. Visitors drift through the final gallery space, their steps softened by thick carpet. One glances at a wall-mounted player, notices the play button glowing faintly, and sits. A disc has already been loaded. No one knows what it is. The audio begins, a choral piece, or spoken word, or nothing at all. And in this soft invitation, this gentle readiness, we find the object again. Not as technology, not as relic, but as companion. Quiet, precise, circular. Still waiting to begin. And so the CD rests again soft in memory, flexible in meaning, always ready to begin anew.